So this metaphor of society as an organism goes back to antiquity. This illustration, I bet a lot of you know, is from the cover of Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan. Of course, the religious concept that a religious community is like a single organism. Most religions actually employ that metaphor. And for the environmentalists, we have Gaia, the earth goddess. And of course, corporations are derived from the Latin word for body, and so there's no end of commentary on how a corporation is like a living organism. Nevertheless, despite its antiquity, this concept has been eclipsed during the last half century by this, you might say, the age of reductionism, the concept that the individual and individual self-interest is some kind of grand explanatory principles. We have methodological individualism in the social sciences. We have the rational actor model in economic theory. And in my own field of evolutionary biology, we have the concept that basically adaptation only occurs at the level of individuals or even genes, the concept of selfish genes. And I think this has been the prevailing paradigm for the last 50 years. And you can't say something like that without the obligatory quote from Margaret Thatcher about how there is no such thing as society, only individual men and women and their families. Until now. So I think that there's really paradigmatic changes in the process of taking place. And what I want to do is I want to introduce you to the following things here. First of all, that the concept of society as an organism, that old metaphor, has been placed on a solid scientific foundation. That it explains both the presence and the absence of functional organization in nature. It explains the genetic evolution of our species, the cultural evolution of our species leading to the mega societies of today, and can help guide our future cultural evolution in a business context and beyond. So that is my modest agenda for the day. And maybe even reconciling Adam Smith with himself. So there's Adam Smith, the invisible hand, a comment side by side with a passage that's actually featured on the Business for Peace website about markets could not flourish without a strong underlying moral culture. How can these statements be put together? How could Adam Smith be right about both, I think, is one of the things that we want to do. So this is a breakfast seminar. So our menu for today, this is going to be like skydiving. We're going to plummet through multi-level selection theory, its biological adaptations, and how it relates to human genetic and cultural evolution. And then I'm going to open the parachute and drift a little more slowly to some of the business and economic applications. So in the beginning, we have the Christian worldview, which of course was that with an all-powerful and beneficent God, then he must have created a world that's harmonious at all levels, from the smallest insect to the cosmos. And the first Enlightenment thinkers, such as Isaac Newton, although they were placing their authority on science and reason rather than scripture, they shared this expectation of a natural order, basically, that the universe is harmonious and that science would enlighten our understanding of this natural order. But Darwin's theory implied otherwise. And I think the reason that Darwin's theory has been so fraught with complications and threat for people, and people have found it so difficult to accept, is that it suggests the possibility that functional order, the kind of design that we associate with an organism such as an insect or a human implement such as a watch, that kind of functional order might exist at a small scale, such as an individual organism, but then cease to exist at a larger scale, yield to chaos, you might say, at a larger scale, such as a society or a ecosystem. So basically, society might not be like an organism. It might be something much more dystopic. And this was the possibility that Darwin discovered. And he was led to this realization by considering the evolution of altruism. Just think of the traits that cause groups to function well. When you behave for the benefit of your group, then how might that behavior fare in a Darwinian world? So here's the fundamental problem. Natural selection is based on relative fitness. It does not matter how well an organism survives and reproduces in absolute terms, only in comparison to other organisms in the vicinity. Behaving for the good of the group seldom maximizes fitness within the group, to the extent that the individual must expend time, energy, risk on behalf of the group. That's the degree to which it's placing itself at a relative fitness disadvantage compared to other individuals that don't do that. So how can such traits evolve? It seems that evolution will weed out altruism. And this goes beyond altruism to traits that we don't think of as altruistic. I like to talk about a no-cost public good. Imagine we're in a group and I do something that benefits all of us, including myself, at no cost to myself. Unrealistic, you might think, but interesting as a thought experiment. Will this behavior evolve? And the answer is, well, maybe not, because by floating all boats, by benefiting everyone, I have not changed any proportions. Natural selection requires differences, and a no-cost public good does not introduce any differences into the group. And so the dismal conclusion is natural selection within a group is insensitive to the welfare of the group. Anything that floats all boats or sinks all boats is not creating differences. And the quickest way I can get you into a relative fitness mood is to ask you to play the game of Monopoly. So Monopoly is the quintessential relative fitness game. If we're starting a game of Monopoly and I offer to give every player $100 extra, they wouldn't care much, right? If I offered to give you $100 and everyone else $200, you'd say, please no, I do not want your $100, because it's all about relative fitness, not about absolute fitness. And the economist Robert Frank, who has been here, makes this point in his book, The Darwin Economy. And here's our first juncture as to why things might be not quite right on the theoretical front, is that in economic theory, the assumption is that the self-regarding actor is attempting to maximize its absolute utility, as if individuals only want to be as wealthy as possible in absolute terms without comparing themselves to other individuals, which is manifestly false. So that's the problem. Darwin also had a solution, which is that social behaviors almost always take place among sets of individuals that are small compared to the total population. So almost all evolving populations are populations of social groups in addition to population of individuals. And while it's true that the altruist is at a disadvantage compared to the non-altruist within each and every one of those groups, it is equally true that the altruistic group robustly will outcompete the non-altruistic group. And so now we have a very interesting situation of evolution going in two different directions, weighing in favor of selfishness at the most local scale and weighing in favor of cooperation and altruism at a slightly larger scale. So now we have a way for altruism to evolve. And the best way for me to communicate that is to ask you to invite you to think of being in a Monopoly tournament where the trophy goes to the team that collectively develops their property the fastest, as opposed to winning within the group. And I think you can see, I've actually done this as an exercise with science club students, and it's so much fun to have them first play the regular game of Monopoly and then change the rules, and then to see what they actually do. And I think you can see nearly every decision you make as a team player will be different than playing the regular game of Monopoly. That's the difference between teamwork and trying to maximize your advantage within a single group. So I think right away, I hope that I have made good on the title of this talk, that we can begin to think in very intuitive terms about the competitive advantage of collaboration, that competition at one level requires cooperation at lower levels, and competition at lower levels, unless it's very carefully refereed. And of course, refereed forms of competition can be very good for the group. But if it's not refereed, then it's likely to be disruptive. So just to generalize here, multi-level selection, natural selection within groups is like a single game of Monopoly. It tends to result in disruptive self-seeking behaviors. Natural selection between groups is like the Monopoly tournament. It tends to result in various forms of teamwork. And teamwork does not come for free. There's no way that cooperation and teamwork just emerges from complex interactions. It requires a process of selection at that scale. So here's a real-world example. Imagine that you're a poultry breeder who wants to increase the egg productivity of hens. Hens are housed in cages, actually not in Norway or Europe, but they're still in groups, okay? And so in one experiment, you monitor the egg productivity and you select the most productive hen within each and every group. And in experiment 2, you monitor the productivity of whole groups, and then you select all of the hens within the most productive group to breed the next generations of hens. And you might think that these experiments are similar, and that the first experiment might work better because, after all, egg productivity is an individual trait. You can count the eggs coming out the hind end of a hen. But here's the result of the first experiment. After 5 generations, what you see here are only 3 hens, not the original 9, because 6 have been murdered. And the surviving 3 have plucked each other in their incessant attacks on themselves. So what happened here? The most productive hen was the biggest bully, and so by selecting the most productive hen, you breed a nation of psychopaths within 5 generations, and it only took 5 generations. So this is how heritable these traits are. So this is like the single game of Monopoly, and here's the result of the second experiment. It's like the Monopoly tournament, and we've bred a breed of cooperative hens. All of this happened in only 6 generations. And I've been using this example a long time. So many years ago, a professor came up after my talk and said, Dr. Wilson, that first chicken experiment is like my department. I have names for those 3 chickens. And so you can just imagine a department that rewards its members for their individual productivity, only for their individual productivity, not for their cooperativeness, what you're going to get. And it's funny, something happened. It wasn't genetic evolution, but it was something similar. Yes, sir?
No, sir. It's just I went to invest.
So genetic evolution didn't happen, but something similar did. And I think this is our first hint that when we talk about these ideas, we're including but going beyond genetic evolution. We're also including cultural evolution. And even more so, we're including the strategies of behaviorally flexible individuals, that in a sense all of us are capable of playing the cooperative card or the selfish card, and which one we play is subject to somewhat the same dynamic as genetic evolution or cultural evolution. So we could use these ideas to explain the fast-paced changes taking place all around us and our own options as individuals, in addition to the grand story of genetic evolution. Now, we need to take this, which I've been talking about at 2 levels, individuals within groups, and stretch it out into a multi-tier hierarchy, groups within groups within groups. In biology, we have genes, individuals, single-species social groups, multi-species ecosystems, and in human life, we have individuals, our social groups, groups within groups within groups. And the same logic appears at every rung of the hierarchy. So in human terms, what's good for me can be bad for my family. What's good for my family can be bad for my clan. All the way up to what's good for my corporation or what's good for my nation can be bad for the global village. And in each and every case, in order for one of these levels to become functionally organized, requires a process of selection at that level and tends to be undermined by selection at lower levels, by unrefereed selection at lower levels. And so this is the dynamic that emerges from multi-level selection theory. So why this is foundational? There's good news and bad news, as they say. The good news is that evolution is not just about selfishness. We can explain altruism and cooperation in all their forms as something that can evolve in a Darwinian world. The bad news is special conditions are required, and those conditions are often quite restrictive. So the same theory explains both the presence and the absence of functional organization, depending upon the conditions. So there is no justification, and never will be a justification, for some kind of natural order that simply emerges at high levels. If we want to create harmony and order at larger scales, we must work for it. We must make it the target of selection. So this is profoundly different than the invisible hand concept, which pretends that somehow lower level self-interest robustly benefits the common good. That is profoundly false. And the concept of laissez-faire, at least in its simple form, simply makes no sense if there is no natural order. If there is no natural order, then there's no prescription for letting it alone. Actually, there is a concept of the invisible hand which can be legitimated, and maybe that can come out in the question and answers. I'm almost done with my skydiving portion of this talk. So the next thing we need to think about is what's called major evolutionary transitions. The fact that this balance between levels of selection is not static but can itself evolve. And so occasionally what happens is mechanisms evolve that suppress the potential for disruptive self-serving behavior within groups. And so now between group selection becomes the dominant evolutionary force, and then those groups become so cooperative that they literally turn into a higher level organism. The group becomes an organism because group selection is the predominant evolutionary force. That is a major evolutionary transition, and it is being used now to explain basically everything we call an organism. Everything from the origin of life itself as groups of cooperating molecular reactions to the first cells, to the nucleated cells, to multicellular organisms, social insect colonies, and so on. And so every biological entity called an organism is a society of lower level units that evolved by between society selection. Organisms from groups, not by small mutational steps from other organisms. And so this metaphor of society as an organism now has been placed on a scientific foundation more than ever before. And then finally, this explains what's so distinctive about our humans, that if you look at our closest relatives, the chimps and the bonobos, what you find are primates much like us, very, very intelligent in their own way, but without a lot of cooperation. A little bit of cooperation and a lot of conflict within groups. And so what made us so special is that mechanisms evolved in our species that suppress the potential for disruptive self-serving behaviors within groups, and then cause the group to be the primary adaptive unit. This resulted in various forms of physical teamwork that are familiar to us, including alloparenting, the wonderful work of Sarah Hrdy as to how it does take a village to raise a child, actually, it turns out. And that's one of the advantages of physical teamwork, along with hunting, gathering, warfare, and so on. But also mental teamwork. And one of the fascinating things about this is to take just about everything distinctive cognitively about our species, especially our capacity for symbolic thought, and to see this as various forms of mental cooperation, including our ability to transmit very large amounts of information across generations, our very capacity for culture, all requires a high degree of cooperation. So the idea is, to the best of our knowledge, is the first event that happened in human evolution was an increase in cooperativeness, and then everything else that's distinctive about our species is a form of cooperation. So cooperation came first. And then, once cultural evolution became elaborated, then it too is a multi-level selection process. And you could look at the last 10,000 years of human history as a product of cultural group selection, leading to ever more larger societies driven largely by warfare, not entirely, and also, of course, by economic activity, which is necessary for any collective purpose, including warfare. And my colleague Peter Turchin, in his book, The Ultra Society, is a wonderful book to read on that topic. Okay, so I'm now going to put on the parachute here for the rest of this talk, and then and introduce you to Elinor Ostrom, already familiar to some of you, but I wager not all. And typically when I give a talk on this topic, I ask, who's heard of Elinor Ostrom? And almost invariably, a minority of hands go up, despite the fact, of course, she's very famous as a Nobel laureate. What did she do? She was a political scientist, actually unknown to most economists before she won the Nobel Prize. And she studied groups that managed common pool resources. The famous tragedy of the commons, the idea that groups cannot manage common pool resources. She actually put that to the test by creating an empirical database of groups that manage common pool resources, often in traditional but also modern societies. And what she showed was, contrary to conventional economic wisdom, which is that the tragedy will always occur unless you privatize the resource or manage it by top-down regulations, contrary to that, that some common pool resource groups were able to manage their resources, but only if they possess certain core design principles. The groups that she studied varied in their ability to manage their resources, and her achievement was to derive the ingredients, the core design principles that cause this particular kind of group to function well. And so now, without further ado, I'm going to show you the 8 core design principles required for the success of these groups. And as I do so, please think about the groups in your life, okay? Business groups or any other kind of group. So, the groups that worked had a strong identity and purpose. They knew that they were a group. They knew the boundaries of the resource. They knew who had access to the resource. There was proportional equivalent of costs and benefits. It was not the case that some members got the benefits and other members paid the cost. Okay, the getting was proportional to giving. There was inclusive decision making. It was not necessarily by strict consensus, but the decision making was an open and transparent process. So it was not possible for some individuals to make decisions for their benefit and not for the benefit of the group. Agreed upon behaviors were monitored. If there were transgressions, then something was done about it. It didn't start out harsh. Most of us are anxious to operate in solid citizen mode and only need a friendly reminder. But then it is necessary to escalate if, in some cases, conflicts will occur and they need to be resolved quickly and in a manner that's fair and respectful to both parties. A group must have some local autonomy. It must have elbow room to do these things. Otherwise, all bets are off. And there must be appropriate relations with other groups, which more or less reflect the same considerations. And this is very important because what it means is that the core design principles are scale independent. They are needed for interactions among groups in just the same way as they are needed for interactions among individuals within groups. And so there they are. And I think you can see, I hope you can see just on the basis of this short introduction, how much the core design principles map on to multi-level selection theory. Very simply, in a group in which these core design principles are strongly implemented, it is very difficult for a member of the group to benefit themselves at the expense of other members of the same group. It's like a miniature major evolutionary transition. And I find it so fascinating that the same conditions that were necessary for us to evolve into such a cooperative species as far as our genetic evolution is concerned are the very same conditions that are needed in our everyday groups in order for us to make the behavioral choices that we would make to cooperate, to play the cooperation card, and not to play the disruptive, self-serving competition card. And so, as Atle said, I was honored to work with Lynn Ostrom for 3 years before her death to generalize the core design principles from an evolutionary perspective. And we have an academic article that we can make available. But what it does, and I also think that you might see this as obvious in retrospect, is we can make a bold prediction that what Ostrom showed for this particular kind of group should hold for any other kind of group, because what we're talking about here is cooperation as itself a common pool resource. So we predict that for any kind of group that you might name, in the first place, when you study how well they work, they will vary, and the best will be the best because they have implemented the core design principles. That's our prediction. And here's some actual data. This was done on a very simple survey. It doesn't take much. You ask somebody, imagine a group that's important to you. How well does the group work? Please rate that. And then please rate the core design principles and present it in a survey form. in this particular data set, is from American college students. I asked them to do this twice. Once for a business group, a group where they had been employed, and once for any other group that they care to think about. And what you see here is that in the first place, so here's how satisfied they are with the group. Here's how well they estimate they implemented the core design principles. Nice relationship. So the two take-home points here are that business groups in gray follow along the same line. So this supports the idea. Yes?
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
How did you define success in the study?
And now, of course, we also want to study groups in much more detail and define success more objectively and so on. But for this survey, we simply asked, imagine a group. How satisfied are you with this group? How well does this group achieve whatever purpose it has? And how much do you trust this group? Okay? So those were the three measures of performance. Okay. So what this is showing is that business groups are no different than any other kind of groups in needing the core design principles. But also, you can see that although on the top end of this graph here, the high-performing groups, business groups are well represented. There's some business groups that work just fine. But as you go to the low end, then you see disproportional representation of business groups, at least in this American sample. So among the groups that work poorly, business groups are overrepresented. I think that there's a reason for that, which we will get that. Okay, so is this old or new? I think that in some ways you can think, wow, this is so new. And then you can think of it again. You can say, wow, this is so obvious. And I've been reading the business and management literature for quite a while now. And it's really remarkable to me that if you were to go into the literature and review the evidence for each of these 8 propositions, that what I find is just like all the evidence I could ask for. It's as if you don't even need to do more research. It's all just lying there in front of our faces in the empirical literature. Here's one example of many that I could cite. It's a book called The Human Equation by a Stanford business professor named Jeffrey Pfeffer. And here's his ingredient for success based on his review of the literature. And I think you can see how well his 7 common practices map onto the core design principles. I don't think I need to belabor that point. And so a Stanford business professor published in the Harvard Business Review Press. You can't get more prestigious than that. In 1998, 20 years ago. Where's that gone? Here's a more recent book by Adam Grant at Wharton Business School professor, Give and Take. A wonderful book, an entertaining book to read. He says there's 3 business strategies. There's the givers, who want to give, give, give. There's the takers, and then there's the matchers, who are willing to give, but only if they know that they're going to get in return. And Adam Grant says, who does best in the business world? The answer is the givers do the best and the worst. They do the best when they surround themselves with other givers. They do the worst when they're surrounded by takers. What would that be but multi-level selection in action? Altruism, selfishness beats altruism within groups. Altruistic groups beat selfish groups. And you probably can't read this, but in the little blurb down at the bottom, it says, as brilliant as it is wise, this is not just a book, it's a new and shining worldview. A new and shining world view, as if this should somehow be new, when in fact it's so old and obvious. And so I think this leads to what I call the paradox of practices that work but don't spread. How is it possible for this core design principle approach to remain marginal despite its real-world efficacy and the abundance of scientific evidence? This is something we really need to think about how successful practices can be both exist and yet, I mean, the fact that they exist means that they've succeeded and spread to a degree, but then spread no further and remain in some sense marginal. And Einstein, when he said it is the theory that decides what we could observe, I think provides the answer to that question, that nothing is obvious all by itself. Things are obvious or non-obvious. They seem right or wrong only against the background of certain assumptions and beliefs. And what we have here is this background of orthodox economic theory. I'm going to end with some quotes. This one is from Herbert Gintis, the evolutionary economist in the United States. He says, Homo economicus has no emotions. He's totally interested in maximizing his wealth and income. He really doesn't care about other people, although he does care about leisure. Leisure, income, and wealth are the only things. When they taught this to business school students, it obviously followed that if you're a good businessman, you should just maximize your material wealth. This is greedy. Being greedy is human. It's good to do. And the more greedy you are, the more successful you'll be. If that's what you're taught, then that's how you will behave. And here's Michael Porter, which I'm sure is well known to most of you and quoted on the Business for Peace website, who says, a big part of the problem lies with the companies themselves, which remain trapped in an outdated approach to value creation that has emerged over the past few decades. Again, I began this talk by saying, that the concept of society as an organism has been eclipsed during the last X years, few decades, 50 years, by this view. They continue to view value creation narrowly, optimizing short-term financial performance in a bubble while missing the most important customer needs and ignoring the broader influences that determine their longer-term success. How else could companies overlook the well-being of their customers, the depletion of natural resources vital to their businesses, the viability of key suppliers, or the economic distress of communities in which they produce and sell? How else could the companies think that simply shifting activities to locations with ever lower wages was a sustainable solution to competitive challenges? And so the point of this is that authority matters. It really matters what theory we operate from. And if you look at the Homo economicus theory, what we see is an absurd conception of human nature, an absurd conception of economic systems in equilibrium, and an absurd conception of theory as mathiness, as the economist Paul Romer calls it. When you do the scholarship, what you find is that actually this is based on a pre-Darwinian conception of theory as like Newtonian physics, that somehow we can have a physics of social behavior that predicts economic systems with the same precision as the location of planets in the solar system. It is just the wrong conception of theory. And what we can replace it with is something that's based on the best of our current knowledge about human nature, social and economic systems and all of their complexity, and a conception of theory commensurate with evolutionary theory and complexity theory. Why is evolutionary theory so general and powerful? Not because you can model it with complex analytical equations, but because it's based on such a very few and such sensible assumptions from which all else follows. And so the key to justifying business worthiness is to ground it in the right theory. Charles Darwin said the highest possible stage in moral culture is when we recognize that we ought to control our thoughts. So I'd like to first of all, say that many of these ideas were worked out with my Norwegian colleagues. I've been coming to Norway now for a good 5 years or so. More on this theme is in this essay on the Internet, Blueprint for a Global Village, which I wrote with Dag Hessen, the wonderful biologist here in Norway. And of course, I have to acknowledge Atle and Nina in our most recent intellectual production here, the Sustainable Modernity, which was just published a few weeks ago, right? So thank you very much.
It's truly humbling to be in the presence of greatness. All of these professors, they know a lot more than I do. So basically, I'm not going to give you my opinion. I'm just going to share some facts with you. And to set this stage for those facts, I would like to point out that things aren't always what they appear. And therefore, we need to dig in a little deeper to find out the facts. Now, one of the things that happened to me is when I was invited to speak here, I've got 7 minutes, which I'm going to use very well. I had to go and actually find out why I was asked to speak with such great, evolutionary biologists such as, Dr. Sloan Wilson, and I spent a lot of time learning about these theories, and I think what I'm going to try to establish here is the fact that what he says is absolutely correct, and it relates in a great way to what China has done and China's rapid rise in the last 25 years, and even explain what Trump is doing right now. So let me try to get into that. But before I do that, I want to ask one simple question. One of the things that we've done is every year is produce what we call a white paper on the business environment in China. And in doing so, we dig into some data to find out what is happening. Now, one of the things that I look at is that we all believe that a large percentage of our annual personal expenditure is spent on made in China label, whether we're in Norway or in the United States. And I often ask that question. Let me see. I'm going to do that. What do you think is the annual percentage of a personal consumer expenditure spent on made in China label? The study that I'm looking at is in the United States. But I bet you if I ask you that question, the number will be somewhere around 50 to 90%. That's a perception that is out there. But what the reality is that the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco, on behalf of Federal Reserve Bank several years ago, did a study to see the impact of inflation in China on the American consumer. Because if we spend 50, 70, 80% of our money on Chinese goods, inflation in China will hurt us. Well, the reality, just to make this quick, the total amount of money, the percentage of our expenditure that we spend on made in China label, and I guarantee you it's the same in Norway as it is in the United States, it's only 2.7%. And that is the wrong number because 1.5% of that is actually paid to the American worker for picking up the product from the port, delivering it, marketing, advertising, sales, packaging, etc. So the total amount of money that goes to China from the American consumer in a year is 1.2%. And that gives me the ability to argue with my politicians saying, wait a minute, how can you explain to me that, how can you tell me 90% of our jobs went to China if we just simply gave them 1.2% of our money? So the math doesn't add up. And that I want to lead into, one of the things that we did, we worked with Professor Michael Enright, chair of the Department of Economics at Hong Kong University, to determine the impact of foreign invested enterprises on China's economy. Now, we didn't do this with Dr. Wilson's theories in mind, but once I started to study, or at least to read on what he's done, it made perfect sense that what has happened in China and China's rapid rise in the last 25 years has been primarily due to collaborative evolution and collaboration between many countries and China. And let me explain what that really means. When we looked at the overall China, we realized that 1/3 of China's GDP is actually created by foreign invested enterprises, not just by Chinese. Now, this number is used, Dr. Enright only used two indicators, one being the amount of FDI that was invested, foreign direct investment invested by foreign companies, and two, the amount of money spent by the employees. Just those two indicators. That creates 1/3 of China's GDP and 27% of employment across China. Now, when we look at these numbers are spread across China. It's an average overall in China. So concentration of foreign invested enterprises in China is primarily on the east coast of China and the southern coast of China, between Shanghai all the way Fuzhou and Hong Kong, the border of Hong Kong in Pearl River Delta area. So let's look at what the impact of foreign invested enterprises, collaboration with foreign companies, is in Shanghai. Now, this is an amazing number. Shanghai is literally the most modern, most advanced city in China. It's been open for many years. Opening up is not a new concept to them. 67% of trade and industrial output of Shanghai is created by foreign invested enterprises. You look at it, 1/3 of the tax revenue, 1/3 employment. Now, what's most amazing is 90% of the high-tech output of Shanghai is produced by foreign invested enterprises. That's quite substantial. I mean, you can interpret that into many different ways. Who is causing the deficit? Is it the Chinese? Okay, and what has that collaboration done? Now, I'll just share with you a couple more statistics. In Shenzhen, which is between Hong Kong and the mainland, on the southern coast of China, 50% of GDP is created by foreign invested enterprises and 50% of employment. is created by foreign investment. There are many other statistics I could share with you, but what collaboration with foreign countries and foreign companies have done into China's GDP. The reality is that yes, people say China opened up 40 years ago. Well, not much happened. When Tiananmen Square happened in '89, everybody left China. People started coming back, including myself in 1991. And as I said, I've spent 26 years working in China. I was lucky, I was given the license to build the very first Western-owned power plant in China, build, own, and operate the very first Western-owned toll road, and I even was given a business license in 1999 to establish the very first Western Catholic University campus in China, which we did for a 4-year U.S. accredited degree. Now, these numbers, when you look at the impact that foreign companies, Norwegian companies, American companies, European companies have had. You look at Chongqing being in southwestern China. Chongqing went from producing zero computers of the world to 1/3 of the world's computers in 6 years by foreign invested enterprises, by collaboration with foreign investment. Now, why am I pointing all that? Now, I'm not going to bother you with a lot of more, but one of the things that I do want to share is that the contribution of foreign invested enterprises, that collaboration, was far more than money and manufacturing and ability and technology. It's a series of benefits that were made available to China and the Chinese economy. Benefits to Chinese consumer, establishing high industry standards, safety, modernization, establishment, distribution network, logistics, supply chain. All of that came through collaboration. Now, the point I'm trying to make here, and I'm going to dump this in Professor Wilson's lab, because that's not my expertise, is the fact that I believe, at least the numbers show me, that we are at the stage where collaboration has taken place, and China's rise really started in 1992 when paramount leader Deng Xiaoping went to Shenzhen and said to be rich is glorious. And that opened the doors in China. So basically 25, 26 years ago, where China's development actually started. And I was there to benefit from it and also to contribute to it in a way. I think I did. Now, what has happened here is that, yes, collaboration between many countries as a group have helped China rise to the level that it is. And why? What is the argument about? Well, I think if I fall back on Professor Wilson's theories that you need both collaboration and competition for things to work, what we realize is that what we've done for the last 26 years is primary collaboration, sharing of technology, altruism in all respect between all countries in helping China's rise. But for the last 3 to 4 years, China has pretty much expressed its desire to protect its own industries. They expressed the feeling that foreign companies were no longer welcome. We have arrived, we could do it ourselves, we don't need you. And that created a problem because I don't think anyone until we released this study realized how important collaboration was to China, how important it continues to be, because if we leave, 1/3 of China's GDP will disappear. So now we want to compete. That means we want to benefit from that collaboration, and I think that's what the European leaders are complaining, that there's no, the playing field is not level, and we want it to be level. Not that we want it to be in favor of foreign companies, we also don't want it to be in favor of Chinese companies. Well, certainly they may need some assistance in order to be on par with foreign companies in competition, but competition is what's going to take to the future. Because once you begin to say, wait a minute, we have benefited from collaboration, but we don't want to compete, that creates a problem. And I'm going to dump this in Professor Wilson's lab, and maybe he can study it far beyond where we are. But thank you all very much.
Yes, brilliant. Now, I think that the first conclusion so far from what's been said by David and Mr. Halley, I think is that the world needs a collaborative revolution. And especially Europe, I'd say, needs a collaborative revolution. The second conclusion is that has been actually hinted at by David when he's quoted Adam Smith, that the basis for thriving markets, institutions, politics is actually a moral culture. And since we know that cultural evolution, David Sloan Wilson style, takes culture seriously, let me just take culture on board here and try to find out, first of all, how it works, or just remind you how it works. And secondly, to compare two radically opposing cultures, the Norwegian, the so-called Norwegian model, and the Polish one from which I come, the so-called Polish model, or I would say now anti-Polish model, because it's self-destructive. The culture as such, I think, can be best summed up by a joke about an anthropologist who comes to an African village and sees cell phones, internet, perfect modernization, and he asks the chief, "Do you have any cannibals left in this village?" And they say, "Oh, no, we've eaten the last one for breakfast." Now, the question is that culture is a very conservative force. It doesn't change overnight. It develops very slowly. We think that it does because fashions surround us and we think that everything goes very quickly. But no, culture is a deep structure in every society, and it does have an influence on the models of business. It does have an influence on political institutions, on political economy, and so on. It's the invisible variable, very often, in our accounts on why people succeed or why they fail. And one of these invisible cannibals in the cultures that you've tried to describe in rosy terms here, the second comment, one of the invisible variables is that there are cannibals in China. Everybody knows that human rights are a problem, and it's the old culture, of the absolute domination of an individual who's treated as a dust, as nobody, as nothing. And in the name of collaboration, the individual's autonomy is very often being bent or destroyed. But that's the cannibals. That's the culture. That's the old, so to speak, evolutionary tale in the history of China. Let's go to Poland and Norway, two varying models, which I think represent two different cultures and also two different models of political economy. I come from a country which has specialized in disasters. That's probably the most succinct definition of what Poland is about. Now, I've been studying this country because I've recently written a book, The Origins of Anti-Authoritarianism, and I've been studying this country through various sources, and there are many, many explanations of why Poland has fared so badly. The political explanations, we've been partitioned, then we've been oppressed by the Soviet Union, then, the collapse of the Soviet Union, post-colonial syndrome, and so on and so forth. Then there is the economic explanations. But actually, it's only after working with David Sloan Wilson that I've changed my perspective and my optics. And I decided to approach the history of my country from this cooperative perspective, let's say more pro-social vision, which has evolved also in Poland, believe it or not. But I think has always been challenged by a much more powerful, feud-ridden and very divisive factional culture. In other words, since the 18th century, the Polish nobility, selfish nobility, sold the country to the partitioning powers. Then, of course, Europe sold the country to the Soviet Union. And now the effect of all this is a society that cannot unite, the opposition that is in complete shambles, and the government that goes back very proudly to the Dark Ages and offers a politics where every single step is a mistake, a la Monty Python. You've seen the Monty Python film, and it's been called by the progressive press, the politics of the Polish government is called the politics of Monty Python steps. This This is more or less every single step that has been under scrutiny, and everyone is worse than the previous one. Now we have the Nordic model, on the other hand, a culture which I've studied, which I've been in the beginning a bit put off. So my first contact with Norway was actually fleeing from this country. But the more I read through it, the more I combed through the Norwegian letters, through the Norwegian history, the more I became aware that what David said in one of his wonderful articles, that Norway is successful because it projected the control mechanisms and the ethos of a small village into the national village, is true. And what are these control mechanisms and norms and values and behavioral patterns of a small village? They are the Elinor Ostrom's principles, and they've been very cleverly projected into the way the Norwegian institutions, the Norwegian business models, the Norwegian markets function. So what you have as an effect is what the world calls democratic capitalism, or a hybrid mixture of capitalism and socialism, which works, which is welfare orientated, and at the same time it's productive. In other words, it is this small group control mechanism joined with the ethos of cooperation, that, and not oil, as the foreigners think. It's not the oil that created the Norwegian success. It is a largely cooperative culture that is able to compete successfully abroad on international markets. Because, as we know, the altruist groups beat the selfish groups, in international competition. And here we have Norway is a particularly interesting example of a competitive advantage of collaboration. And there are very few cannibals there, I'm afraid. Perhaps a janteloven, which we should talk more about, but at a different lecture. But let me finish by, again, another illustration of how Norway and Poland functioned. This is a joke I created from other jokes, okay? This is a kind of I think it's a perpetuum mobile joke. We are in hell, and the hell is full, as we know, of cauldrons in which the wretched souls of the sinners are cooking in tar. There are two cauldrons which are very, very special. One is being heavily guarded by the devils, and it's the most guarded cauldron in hell. And the other one, no guards, no devils, nothing. What happens? The first cauldron is Norwegian, because every now and then the Norwegian sinners manage to create a collaborative action to get out of the cauldron, and they are usually almost successful. Hence, the devils know that they are very much adroit in thinking of a way to get out of the cauldron and to prevent the catastrophe and, become free, and hence it's heavily guarded. Whereas the Polish cauldron, of course, doesn't need any guards, because every time a Pole, a wretched soul, manages to climb up, the others are dragging him down. And no guards, no devils. And this perhaps is best illustrated in the recent drama in the European Union. You probably know that the president of the European Council is a Pole. It's Donald Tusk, and he was unanimously voted as for the next term of his presidency, with one exception: the Poles, who voted against him. Right? I mean, this is the Polish cauldron, and this is the Polish cauldron deluxe. Now, it drives me bananas, but there you are. The Norwegian cauldron, the one which I admire, is, I think, a classical example of not just cooperative spirit, but also pro-sociality. And here another illustration: Jens Stoltenberg, who is the head of NATO, as we know, is not liked by all the parties in Norway. He is not popular with everybody, and yet the Norwegians unanimously support him and show solidarity with whatever he says or whatever he does, which means that, the guy is going to be a success. Now, as with poor Donald Tusk is going to probably put on trial when back in Poland. And I'd like to finish with one wish. I wish that David Stowe-Wilson was appointed as a special advisor to the Polish government so that at last he could civilize Poland. Thank you very much.
Actually, one of the first times I was talking about the so-called Norwegian lesson and the concession system was in China in 1979, 1980, when China decided that they wanted to use the sort of basis in the Norwegian concession system when they invited foreign companies. But I must say I've heard a lot about trust and collaboration those days, and Atle asked me in particular to address a little bit the one of the most important compromises we have had in the oil industry between the so-called Gro from the Labour Party, Kåre from the Conservative, back in '84. But from day one, actually, when I look at this, we have had call it the good fortune or something that has been built up over the years, that collaboration is really the foundation and basis for very much of what we have, and the institutionalization is the main mean of utilizing this. But such as this important compromise doesn't come out of the air. And I must say, as I said, from day one, this has been very important. And I'm only going to use one slide, and that illustrates also the, where is the, oh, this one. We have a long, long country. And this is all about the oil. I'm not going to talk too much about that. This is also the Northern Atlantic. But first of all, we have very different, what should I say, populations in a way, or very different interests. But it has been a common goal in Norway all the time to make sure that we have population up along here. And fishery, of course, is very important. Military has been important, but especially fishery. And then you are immediately into a challenge from a political point of view to this collaboration you need with the oil, which is a high priority. And secondly, we have the other, that we want people to live up there and to living not only based on oil, fishery in particular. Then you have to compromise. Then you have to get into a collaboration, which calls for trust, actually. And this has been the case. The same here. I'll come a little bit back to that, all the borderline issues with our countries around. Again, you are talking about trust and collaboration. And from day one, when we started we also decided to go stepwise, not open it widely, but go stepwise to secure this an acceptance among different industries that we have to live together. So this has been the sort of the start on a broader level. I'll just use a couple of examples before I come back to this compromise, which illustrates the main point. The three examples is that from when we started the concessions, we decided to divide into license areas, blocks as we call it. There was a company who wanted to have the whole shelf for themselves, but we quickly in Norway decided that, well, this was not the way to go. And also in each of the licenses, we have, except for the first one, we have always more than one company in the license. And we have, they know that the criteria for the next concession round is that they have been active partners. And the whole thinking is that nobody has the full, all the components themselves. But this kind of collaboration, discussion, is to the benefit of both, to the benefit of the nation in the next phase. Because geology and exploration is certainly not black and white things. Being a geologist, you certainly learn that you almost every day when you predict the well and discover that it was very different when you come down there, you learn a lesson that have some be a little bit careful being too strong in your view. Secondly, we also have other examples that we have, to have collaboration in this industry has always been easy when it comes to safety and drilling, and not because it's not competitive, but because everybody knows that if you have a big blowout, a big accident, it hurts the whole industry. So there is a strong motive in the whole industry when it comes to safety issue. The most difficult one is when it comes to the exploration and before you have been awarded. And this was an example that I was the initiator myself when I was an MPD, because we believe strongly that it's to the benefit that you have some certain collaboration also in this, which is to the heart of the competitiveness of the companies. It wasn't very easy actually, but what I did was that I invited all the exploration managers since I was one of the directors at NPD. They knew they met me next concession round in the negotiations, and we asked them to share views on exploration thinking and so on. Today it's a bit more than it used to be. In those days it was one of the really difficult areas to get cooperation to the benefit of all actually. So I invited, and I had a good friend who was the exploration manager in Oslo, Jim Hedberg, and we have agreed that he should be very critical to me from the government after presenting the views of the government. And these companies want this more than this stepwise exploration, and he called it an exploration with peepholes in the Barents Sea. And people were a bit stunned, but they knew that we were in a position because the shelf was so important that they were willing to go pretty far. And looking back at it, this exploration manager meeting, which was initiated in late 70s, has been an annual thing since that. And I think, again, it was initiated because gradually everybody saw that this was an advantage, but it certainly wasn't easy in the beginning. But with the help of the fact that the government was active, and I was represented on all the negotiations, the 17 first years, well, then people tended to be more positive than they would be. And they liked it, of course, when you start getting into it, because all people loves talking about colleagues and getting into discussions. So that example, then coming back to this group core and this big compromise. This was in 1984. The background was that we had a system where everybody agreed that we should establish the state-owned company, Statoil, in the 70s. But then with the oil price hiking up, especially into the 80s, and people, everybody, not everybody, a lot of the majority actually of the economists who were looking at including, I'm not going to mention any names, but because some of them are still active, that they were talking about the oil prices way above $200 in year 2000 because everything went up. And when Ministry of Finance looked at this, they found that Statoil taking care of all the state participation, which was at least 50%. Then they would start to get the budget, which was larger than the Norwegian budget. And by that time, we had gotten the more traditional conservative, more privatization, labor, more state active, and the traditional ways. But both agreed it was unacceptable that you had one company dominating that much. So we came to this core compromise, and they were certainly not in the fights, in the political debates. They were, very strong in the arguments. But when it came to probably very much, what shall I say, supported by this collaboration, trust thinking that we are blessed with in Norway, was the initiative. So they made this company. There was first the committee, Melby in '83, and then you had the Storting, not proposition, but melding in '84 that established what called the state direct participation and took away most of what Statoil had, except for the some of the key fields that gave the basis for them to develop. So it was a very good compromise, and to me a very, very important compromise, because it would be unacceptable, especially a small country with one company dominating that much. Actually, it was a little bit more complicated in the Labour Party than in the Conservative to get this through, because in the Labour Party, although Gro and the leadership saw the importance of having a compromise where one company didn't come that close. You know, the Labour Party, most of the Labour people considered Statoil as our company. But with a strong leader, with sensible leaders on both sides, we got this compromise, which has been extremely important, both to avoid one company dominating that much, and secondly, it has been a fantastic income for the Norwegian state, or the money that flows into and is down in this sovereign fund, which is more than 8,000 billion or something, one of the world's largest that we have. So I think this illustrates that trust and collaboration is really the foundation for the oil policy we have. And just one mention at the end, and that's the area up here. Time is over, or? No. Well, time is over, but I'm going to end. And we have this area with all the borderline issues. I've been involved in all of them, actually, but especially the one with the Russian. Was part of the negotiation for 14 of those more than 30 years that we negotiated, and ended up with a very fair deal, I must say. And 50-50, if you look historically, when a big nation negotiated with a small nation on land or sea areas, the bigger nation tends to take the brothers here. Not so here. This is a 50-50 deal, and I think very much has to do with the long term. We have had common borderline for more than 1,000 years and never war with each other. And that makes something, and that does something in spite of periodically very different political system. So, thank you for inviting me, and thank you for listening.
So, to put it very shortly, very briefly, the question is about the need for monitoring if you have high trust to implement the design principles.
Well, first, let me thank the three of you for your wonderful contributions, which often touched upon the presence and absence of trust. And it made me think that what's really needed is for experts in all of these different areas to absorb the theory and then to add their own expertise to that theory. I think that's what's starting to happen just now. But the more it happens, I think, then we get the combination of the appropriate theoretical framework plus the expertise on any particular topic. It's not as if there's a silver bullet here that can immediately come up with answers. It's much more complicated than that. But what you say about monitoring, I think it's a great question. And there's good and bad forms of monitoring. And if monitoring signals distrust, then it can create a big part of the problem. So I think that you've raised a great point, and I don't think I need to elaborate on it too much. Number one, you need monitoring, but on the other hand, it has to be something which also is predicated upon trust. And there's also, I think, a kind of a positive feedback cycle, that if you are in a situation of distrust, then you need to work iteratively, I think, in order to achieve a situation of trust.
I have a question for Bergsaker. I believe, or my impression is that when Norway got into the lucky situation, if I can say that, finding oil, we were a rather poor, small country with potato-eating people on mountaintops. Then this happened. I would think all international large oil companies thought, greed is good, we're going to get in here and take a fair share of this. Am I right in thinking or believing that an Iraqi oil engineer who had married a Norwegian woman came to Norway because they had a seriously sick child? He realized that if the Norwegian government doesn't realize that they have to develop their model in securing Norway to keep most of this revenue to themselves with a good model, if this engineer had not gone to the Norwegian government, how would this have developed? I'm tempted to ask you. Thank you.
Well, I think the model will have been very much the same. Farouk was a colleague of mine for many years in NPD, and his strength was his, and I think what he contributed most with was actually when we had the oil price was going down in the 80s, and he was a key person in this initiative that was taken to improve oil recovery. He was a knowledgeable technical guy, but his sort of knowledge on politics wasn't exactly the same level. He came from a very different background, and so the whole model had very little to do with that, I must say. But his strength and contribution was very much related to his technical knowledge, and especially within the area of an internationalization, international cooperation, when it came to improved oil recovery in the time when it hiked up on that one. But I think the model must have been that was driven from what I should say, politicians who, and this whole, what I should say, I call it collaboration and trust that Norway for many, many years has been built on. And by the way, the description of the potatoes may be a little bit exaggerated, but I guess that's what you meant. But since you thanked us, I would like to thank you too. I must admit that I didn't know who you were, being a geologist and involved in that. But when I started to look at this to say and told that you are coming, my wife, he knew very well about what you had written. And she was very impressed with what you have. So I learned quite a bit from her about you.
Can I just say a bit? Thank you. And I think that one of the things that's so striking about your description, and it happens again and again with all my conversations about Norwegian policy formulation, is how systemic it is. That there just seems to be an awareness that there's some higher entity, Norway, and that whatever we're doing with developing the oil industry and so on needs to be worked out in the context of a larger system, which, as you just described it, includes not just the oil industry, that's complex enough, but also other sectors. And when you talk about such things as flexicurity and so on, it's just you really have a systemic view and the feeling that whatever needs to be worked out needs to be fair within that system, so that there's nothing is unfair within the system, but that it's the system that we're trying to improve, and what we're creating is systemically good and also fairly distributed within the system. All of that seems to be implicit, I think, in the way things are done here and why they work well. And I also wanted to make the point very briefly that when you see corruption wherever it exists, it's almost always cooperation at a lower scale. Corruption is nothing more or less than small-scale cooperation with all of the same moral dictates. So really it is a matter of building up the scale of cooperation. And if you fail to do that, then you get corruption in one form or another.
On the way to the next question, I just want to dwell a little bit, one more round on this differences in political culture and business culture. And I assume, Harley, working in China with an American background and once upon a time an Iranian, was it, background. What is your comment on cultures and transcending them in your practice?
Well, not being an expert, I just believe that people are people. People have basic needs, and people try to work very hard to fulfill those needs. I believe that everyone has a common desire, which is basically to try to make available a better life for children than they had themselves. And that is what drives collaboration. That's what drives the desire to move up the value chain and be at the top of it. And that's how people get along or argue or agree and disagree.
So you fall back on some of the basic human coexistence, which probably is a wise. Well, Nina, are you contradicting this point?
No, at some level, definitely you're right, at some level. But unfortunately, it's much more complicated than that people are driven by all kinds of aspirations apart from ensuring that the children have a better life. It seems to me that there are societies that develop particular, to use Alexis de Tocqueville's expression, habits of the heart and habits of the mind. And I know that your own culture, the Iranian culture, because I'm working with the Iranian dissidents for now. I'm a part of the Human Rights Iran, and they're constantly complaining about impossibility to unite Iranians about anything, actually, and how divided and sectarian even the dissident culture among the Iranians is. So it's extremely difficult to actually produce an alternative society that would challenge effectively the current regime. So again, these are cultural norms and values that have been reproduced from generation to generation and weigh on the present. My sense is that it is slightly more complicated than that.
Could I have one comment?
Okay.
You guys aren't going to have any other say because we're just going to be
Very quickly, because I was in Iran, and it would be interesting on that comment with a minister way back, 15 years ago. The first time I was there, and it took about 15 minutes from we landed until the Iranians told us we are Iranians, not Arabs. What implication? So there is some sort of unity.
Right, that's very different culture, different language, different needs, and different way people have evolved.
Absolutely.
Completely different.
At this level, there is unity.
Yeah, right.
That's true.
So I wanted to add that all of our social identities now are socially constructed for the most part, and so and that is an ongoing process which can be much more difficult in some cases than others. So one social identity can be very deeply entrenched and difficult to change based on searing experiences and so on. But on the other hand, it still is possible to change, and often when you do standard negotiation processes, that's what you're doing, is you're building a social identity, if only for the moment. I just want to tell a story about Werner Christie, one of the wonderful people I've met here in Norway. When he was health minister, he was trying to develop some health system, hospital system, and he got administrators from different hospitals together that were more or less viewing themselves as competitors, and he got them in a room, and he said, for the purpose of this meeting, you are charged with developing a system, basically, that all of you could work on. And he got them to think of themselves as the members of a single group, not to be competitors, but the members of a single group that were collaborating in order to do something systemically. And he succeeded. So I think that especially in a business context, when we're forming and breaking groups all the time, then there's that incredible fluidity and flexibility, and that knowing that, then when we create a group for the purpose of doing something, then if we're mindful about the core design principles, plus more, this more than the core design principles, but we actually play the role of social engineer in a way, in a benign sense, then we can make a lot of progress designing our groups to function well on a very fluid basis.
I have a question to David. My name is Jenny Ahlström. I work as a senior advisor at the Agency for Public Management and E-Government here in Oslo. Yeah, And I recently finished my PhD on global supply chains and business and human rights. And my question is concerning the Paris Agreement that we heard Christiana, what's her name, Figueres, talk about yesterday. She was heading this in 2015 for this successful Paris Agreement, which was quite an accomplishment because of the failure of the Copenhagen in 2009. And I was wondering, would you say this could be an example of these core design principles? Yeah.
Thank you. This gives me an opportunity to talk about another concept that Ostrom was known for, called polycentric governance. And very simply, what it means is that life consists of many spheres of activity. Each sphere has an optimal scale, and so good governance requires finding the optimal scale for each activity and appropriately coordinating among the scales. Okay, so it's basically extending her ideas and her husband's, Vincent Ostrom's ideas, up to the level of large-scale governance. And against that background, she herself has written on such things as global climate policy. And what she says is that it's not enough to have sort of this top-level agreement. It's something that you'd like to have, but what you have to do is you have to orchestrate it all up and down, from the smallest scale to the largest scale. And I like to think of this as multicellular society. We're composed of trillions of cells, and unless the cells are working well, then the whole organism can't work well. And there's a bottom-up component in addition to a top-down component. I think this is very important. This is why libertarians tend to like Elinor Ostrom, is because of her focus on small groups and the need to do things at the appropriate scale, and that scale being typically a smaller scale. So in a sense, it's an argument against such things as big government. So she has some articles. Some of her last articles were on this very topic, applying the concept of polycentric governance to global issues. And it's optimistic, because what it means is that whoever you are, an individual or a group or whatever, is you can get going in a bottom-up fashion. And then you can then be part of the solution. And then the top-down assistance ends up being quite strategic, that the top-down influence comes in just in kind of a targeted way. For example, imposing sanctions that the groups can't impose on each other, then it comes in at that moment. So there's kind of a plan that she has been influential in formulating.
So my name's John Katzos. I'm an associate professor of business law at the American University of Sharjah, which is the #1 business school in the Middle East and North Africa. I study businesses in conflict zones and how they impact peace. Oh, sure, sorry. I study businesses and how they impact peace processes in conflict zones. So I've done a lot of work in Iraq, in Syria, in Sri Lanka, and in other regional countries. Your core design principles sound great. I can't think of a single business entity that I've seen in a conflict zone or a single conflict zone that meets any of those criteria. And so my question comes back to something all four of you have mentioned at some point, which is, how do you change a group from one that doesn't meet any of the criteria of the core design principles to one that slowly is able to build the momentum that we see now with a country like Norway? So if Norway has all 8, how do we even get to the point where we have 1 or 2?
So we have developed a practical method called prosocial for coaching groups, and we're very eager to apply it to situations worldwide. We're trying actually to develop a worldwide framework for coaching groups in the core design principles. And a very important part of prosocial is not only the core design principles, but methods to increase both psychological and organizational flexibility. Because the fact is change is difficult for individuals or for groups. If you want to accomplish your idealistic goals, we know every year with our New Year's resolutions that we typically fail. So this leads to actually another application of evolutionary theory that is very, very fascinating, that on the one hand, we're hyper flexible, but also we're driven to do things which are actually typically adaptive in the evolutionary sense of the word, but not necessarily in the normative sense of the word. And most of what we regard as pathological is adaptive in the evolutionary sense of the word. And so this is actually a form of therapy, although we want to lose some of the connotations of that word. Therapy for individuals, therapy for groups, that you can, first of all, ask the question, where do we want to go? And secondly, to appreciate it might not be easy to get there, that we might have to work around obstacles and so on, and that needs our attention also. But on the Middle East, one of the books that I recently read was by General Stanley McChrystal, who was in charge of U.S. forces in the Obama and the Bush eras. The book is called Team of Teams, and it was about how the American military, although it was easy to win the Iraq War initially, then Al-Qaeda and a different form of warfare required a total makeover, basically, of how the U.S. military operated, which he succeeded in doing through the creation of, in the first place, small teams that could operate on their own, okay, without having to go up and down a chain of command. But that wasn't good enough, because if you merely had small teams situated in a standard chain of command, no, he had to actually have teams of teams and managed to do so. And his account seems very authentic to me. So I think that there's some optimism there, that in the most difficult of circumstances, then you could, you can accomplish this. And also, as I've been actually participating in a number of national security forums, and then when we think of such things as the deep state, and what it boils down to is entrenched bureaucracies, and bureaucracies which basically have become built and designed for their own perpetuation, and which is therefore part of the problem up the scale. And I'm hearing all the time about how nonprofits and international aid NGOs are actually, they evolved for their own perpetuation and not for their actual mission. So these are, again, case after case after case of cultural evolution leading to cooperation at some scale, which becomes part of the problem. And what it leads to, inexorably, I think, is the conclusion, is that our morality, the morality that informs all of this, has to be a whole earth ethic. It has to be a whole earth ethic. That seems so strange because, of course, many people have that ethic, but it seems like a soft ethic, like something that, nice but totally impractical. But this is I think, a new form of scientific support for the ideas that we have to have in our policies, earth first. And in just the same way that Norway seems to be good at Norway first and then arranging everything below that, then we need earth first, arranging everything below that. And that has to be the moral norm. That has to be what's right. And then all of the lower level entities have to subordinate themselves to that. I don't know if it's possible, but it's what's required.
Okay. I think we allow a short comment from all of you to this very challenging question.
Yes, and if you are in a specific situation, which is difficult, like you described, it's very difficult to see how they can fulfill those important criteria. But I think somehow, if you have it go, and how can you make sure that everybody see it? Well, it's difficult to say, but I will use just one example that I mentioned, these exploration managers, which are really at the heart of the competitiveness. When we initiated this, it was sort of out of the question that they should do that. But they knew that if they didn't, they had problems in the next phase when it came to allocation of new blocks in one of the most prospective areas of the world at the time. And then, and there was this surrounding that, and once you get it going, everybody thinks that sees the advantage, but you have something that, is more than just the willingness that creates the environment for it. But then when it starts going, it goes.
Right. As a historian, I have two examples from Poland and Norway again. It seems to me that one of the impetus, or a very important impetus towards the Norwegian cooperative culture has been given by a small group of people known as Haugians, the Hans Nielsen Hauge, who was not only a pietist preacher, but also a social entrepreneur with a very strong ethos, with a very strong moral spine, so to speak, and the moral code that whose friends, that's what they call themselves, a small group, were actually starting on the margin of society, and we know he spent about 9 years in prison. So it was a small group of people who followed their codes and at the same time were very strong as social entrepreneurs, and slowly but steadily they became influential enough so that let's say their culture penetrated Norway, I would say, a Norwegian political and economic life. So what happened was that they, founded University of Oslo. They founded the first publishing houses. They built cement factories that saved Norway during the Napoleonic blockade, and so on and so on. So it's incredible, how much a small group of people can actually achieve. And I think that much of the Norwegian civilized capitalism is still marked by the Haugian influence. It's a very important factor, cultural factor in Norwegian business. And the second example comes from Poland, and that's why it gives me hope that there is again a talk about the small group of people that met in a small apartment in Warsaw in 1976, and during 4 years managed to build, they called themselves Committee for Workers' Defense. Their ethos was strongly cooperative. The operative modus was very much using all the Ostromian principles, actually, and they were following them to the of course, they didn't know about Ostrom, but actually they were a pure illustration of what Ostrom is, Ostrom's ideal of a sustainable community is. And they managed to create one of the biggest anti-totalitarian movements in the world, Solidarność, in 1980 and 81, and then the revolution in 1989. And this is, again, a small group of people following the codes. So it's an interesting thing how much, small marginal groups in various societies can achieve using appropriate strategies. So there is hope.
Thank you. I'm going to skip all the elaborate thank yous. It's been really interesting. I'm concerned about, or I'm interested in the interaction between what the individual does and what the social norms around it does. And this is a question that sort of comes regardless of what scale you're on. I'm also wondering about the role of sickness and methodology and illness and what the social norms do to try and change the behavior of the individual, again, scaleless, to form it so that it becomes beneficial for the group as a whole. The short and vulgar form of my question is there actually, biologically speaking, a good reason for having psychopaths or other sorts of illnesses in society? And secondly, is there a way that we should actually start to celebrate death also of social organizations? Because sometimes that is the best thing that can happen. Thank you.
Intriguing. So is it all about illness and death? Please wait for the next question. I hope it's more uplifting.
The pressure to be uplifting. Hi, my name is Nkoko Sikiti from Johannesburg, South Africa. It's great to hear of another dysfunctional country. You give me hope. My question is twofold, but quite straightforward. I mean, basically, in terms of the kind of work that you're doing, and it's directed really to the academics, how much funding does it command? And to what extent do you think it can enter into the mainstream of standard economic theory? And I think the background for me, just to maybe scale it up, I'm also a recovering, economist. And the power and the impact of your kind of Homo economicus is really, it's been huge when you consider how the idea of profit maximizing entities, utility maximizing individual, and the kind of theories that leads to the way in which a lot of theories, particularly that come out of the US, are very mathematics based. History has kind of been eliminated from a lot of campuses and from a lot of economics courses, and so you kind of have a theory that has a lot of amnesia. It's got no background, it's got no context, and so when you say it's obvious, the points that you're making and that Ostrom has indicated through a lot of work, I mean, of course it is obvious, but it's only obvious if you know what has happened. If you look at European history, I mean, colonization on its own is a nice example of cooperation and competition, right? Because they're competing, and then at a point they sit down and say, oh, look, we're going to go carve up that piece of land over there so that each of us can get a share, so that the competition is not mutually destructive between us. But now when you come to academia and you study, it's devoid of all of that. And so you have no context. And so when there are conflicts in Sri Lanka or in Iran, if there is no funding to generate research to understand how that works, that thinking cannot then cascade down to really generate practical solutions that people can use, because people will come and tell you, actually, what you need is structural adjustment. And so you need less government, you need A, B, and C, and D, things that are very much in contradiction with the very contradiction that Adam Smith cited, right? It's almost like a selective picking. The self-maximizing individual is what will be there. So how is there money for the work that you do? And will it be picked up? Basically, because if it isn't, I think it has dire implications for a lot of other people who are in positions where they must take knowledge from the US and from elsewhere.
Very good. Timely question about how to promote this line of thinking against the hard, tough position of the methodological individualism and Homo economicus. But first, maybe death and sickness. Any comments to that? It's a tough one.
So, of course, you raise so many issues. And one point I want to make about just health is that, and one I think the most interesting implications of this is that the small group is like a fundamental unit of human social organization that's been made invisible, among other things, by the economic and individualism of all sorts. And so as individuals, we really need to be in small nurturing groups. And if we are, then we get multiple assets and multiple deficits go away. So if there's a single prescription, it's just rebuild small groups, which you often came for free, often are eroded. Many of you know the book Bowling Alone about the erosion of small groups in America and so on. Just briefly, this is a long conversation. Take something like psychopathology or psychopath as a strategy, basically. And yes, I mean, most of these things are succeeding, and just about everything we call immoral benefits the immoral individual. We call it immoral because of the harm done to other individuals. So you can explain, in a sense, these, but that doesn't mean they're necessarily good for the group. And as for the importance of death and the importance of death of some groups, yes, I think that's an interesting line of inquiry. But to turn to your points here, I think that I'll make three quick points. I think that the economic orthodoxy is one of the best examples of what Thomas Kuhn meant by paradigms that you'll ever find. And so this is a system that is internally very stable. And in order to go beyond it, you really have to just kind of start from scratch with another set of assumptions and so on. It's very hard to do incremental change from the assumptions of Homo economicus and I think the field of behavioral economics is a really good example of that. And in some sense, behavioral economists are saying, we need a theory based on Homo sapiens, not Homo economicus. But if you look at it, what they actually do, all they've done is come up with a list of anomalies and paradoxes, which are only anomalous and paradoxical against the background of standard economic theory. So, and actually, I have an essay on this if you email me as to whether this can be incremental change or whether it needs to be paradigmatic change. But if you look at how this became the dominant paradigm, then what you find is that it began as a small group of intellectuals supported by people of means and organizations of means, the Mont Pelerin Society, the big think tanks, which systematically went to establish this worldview. It was a marginal view prior to World War II. And the reason it was established was by a small group of intellectuals supported by people and organizations of means, which led to this kind of behemoth that we have today. And so that's what needs to take place again. There needs to be, we have the group of intellectuals, but in terms of the support, I think that's something which is only now forthcoming. And so the more I think we can repeat the history of the Mont Pelerin Society and this collaboration between this new theoretical framework plus people that are trying to develop it, people and organizations of means trying to develop it, which might be individuals, it might be corporations, it might be governments, then we can make more rapid progress.
Okay, any other comments? It strikes me, by the way, that there is an interesting link between the psychopath idea and the corporation. There is a famous book by Joel Bakken, he's been here lecturing, called The Corporation, and his main point is the legal design of a corporation is a prescription for psychopathy. It's maximizing profit and nothing else. This is the core of the setup of the corporation. So we have to dig deep to change things, even into corporate structure.
I wanted to say that I don't want to portray this worldview as too marginal. And there's an internet magazine called evonomics.com, in which this gets presented to a larger audience. And evonomics.com, which is run by my former student and current associate Robert Kadar, actually has achieved a circulation of about a third of a million page views a month. It's widely read. It's more read than INET and most of the other big think tanks. So this is actually a view that's becoming quite widely discussed, and I don't want to portray it as too marginal. So, and evonomics.com is one of the ways to learn about it in an accessible way.
Okay. Any short comments from the rest of you?
Not on the death.
No.
I did.
Well, then it remains for me just to thank you all for sticking out 10 minutes extra. I take it as a compliment to David and our commentators for having explored an important and very interesting subject, which many of us think should be more central in business schools. So I'd very much welcome collaboration and networking around how to make that happen, in addition to what David says is already existing. And thank you all for joining in. And